Hello, how are you? Comment ça va? Ça va bien? Très bien. Aujourd'hui, nous allons parler du passé composé. Today, we're going to talk about les passés composés. This time, or this tense in French, actually, it brings a lot of confusion to French learners. But today, we are going to break all the mysteries. Woo! Okay, le passé composé, it's actually a tense used in French to express about past event. Okay, of course we have different kind of past in French, but of course the passé composé, it is the common one used daily to express about finished event in the past. Okay, now we're gonna learn how to create that, how to constitute that, and then there are some rules that we are going to learn in this video that's gonna make you to acquire this is once for all and avoiding all kinds of confusions. Okay, so let's go. So how do we make the passé composé? Okay, now first things you need to know when you want to form the passé composé, we use the subject, okay, and then we have the verb, the auxiliary verbs, which can be le verbe être or le verbe avoir, okay, in present. All right, and then we have the past participle, and this is how it is formulated. Of course, before you know that, before you acquire that, you have to know how to conjugate the verbs to be like the verb être, okay, in present, and le verbe avoir in present as well. Okay, now let's go with the verbs être, which is the verbs to be. Okay, je suis, tu es, il est, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, elles sont. Now, for the verbs to have, le verbe être, le verbe avoir, j'ai, tu as, il a, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont, elles ont. So this will serve as an auxiliary verbs that is going to help us on how to form les passés composés. Okay? Now, when we know how to conjugate that, we are going to now complete the verbs with the past participle. For example, j'ai mangé la nourriture. J'ai travaillé hier. You see that? I'm using the auxiliary of the verb être, the verb avoir, plus the past participles. But now, we also have some verbs that uses the verb être as an auxiliary verbs. For example, je suis tombé. It's still the passé composé. Je suis devenu. Je suis monté. Tu es monté. You see, I'm using the auxiliary of the verb être to compose the passé composé. Now the question is to ask, when do we use l'auxiliaire avoir, the avoir auxiliary, and when do we use the auxiliary of le verbe être? This is the big question mark. Now, 90% of verbs in French, when you want to compose le passé composé, they use the auxiliary verb avoir, okay? J'ai chanté, j'ai dormi, okay? But now, when or what kind of verbs is it used to compose le passé composé with the auxiliary of le verbe être, okay? Now, we have this one. First, you need to know they are movimental verbs, okay? The verbs of movement, that's the first reason, as it can be summarized with this picture. You can see that. Those verbs in this house, okay, it is used, okay, with the auxiliary of the verb être, okay? Or a better way to acquire that, you can talk about Dr. Mrs. Trump. Vito, what are you talking about? Dr. Mrs. Trump. There we go. Devenir, rentrer, monter, revenir, sortir, venir, arriver, naître, descendre, entrer, retourner, tomber, rester, aller, mourir, passer, partir. Those are the verbs you are going to use with the auxiliary of le verbe être. For example, venir, je suis venu. Tomber, tu es tombé. Rester, aller, je suis allé. Sortir, tu es sorti. You see? So, in these verbs, I'm going to use the auxiliary of le verbe être. Is that hard to know? No. That's the second reason. The third reason why we use, or when we use le auxiliary, l'auxiliaire, le verbe être, we use it in the pronominal verbs, les verbes pronominal. Okay? The verbs, which is pronominal. For example, s'est lavé, s'est réveillé. You see, I have a pronoun connected with the verbs. For example, je me suis réveillé. Nous nous sommes réveillés. Il s'est lavé. You see that? So, the pronominal verbs, we are going to use that with the auxiliary of le verbe être. Okay? Can we repeat that? The first things to understand is the verbs of movement. Okay? Just as we have learned in the house, or a better way to know that, it's about Dr. Mrs. Trump. Okay? The list of the verb that we just mentioned, and the third reasons about pronominal verbs. But now, don't worry, this is just the theory. We're gonna go with practice to do more exercises, okay, to fix it up once for all, okay? Very good. But now we're gonna talk about the past participle. How does it form, or how do we form that in French, okay? This is kind of a small challenge, but we are going to overcome that, all right? Very simple. Now, all the verb that finishes with er or by er, for example, aller, chanter, danser, they are ways to get or to become the past participle. You just remove the r, you add an accent on the e. For example, je suis rentré, j'ai mangé. So all the verbs that finishes by er, okay, if you want to form le participe passé, you are just going to remove the r and of course putting the accent, okay? This is standard. There's no other reason, or you will never see any other things different than that. But now, other types of verbs, they are irregular. That's one you have to learn how to get used with that. Of course, there are some standard of verbs, okay? I'm gonna drop that in the description section, all right? To emphasize more about that. For example, most of the verb that finishes by er, because I'm talking in French, hier, you say fini. For example, j'ai fini. Il a vomi. You see? But it's not always like this. So there are some rules of some verbs of how we form les passés composés. I mean, le participe passé. Okay? Very simple though. Now, before we go further with the exercise, I would like to emphasize something very important about all the verbs which is conjugated with the auxiliary être. So you have to understand that there's a rule in French. Whenever you are using the auxiliary with the verb être, it has a different form to be used. I'm going to give an example. Look. Il est allé. Il est allé au restaurant. Elle est allée au restaurant. So it means all the time we use the auxiliary of le verbe être. Le participe passé, the past participle, receive the gender of the subject, the gender and the numbers. For example, nous sommes partis. You see? Parti, it has S because nous, it's plural. So it is only in the case when we use the auxiliary of le verbe être that the past participle has to get the gender and numbers of the subjects. For the verbs conjugated with the auxiliary of le verbe avoir, we don't need that for now because there's some other reasons. But for now, okay, for example, elles ont mangé. Elles ont mangé. Elles sont parties. Elles sont parties. You see? Partie, I'm putting ES. E because it's feminine and S because it's plural. So only in the case when we use the Passé Composé with the auxiliary of le verbe être that we use these rules. Okay? Now let's go with some exercises to fix it. And of course, if you got any questions, do not hesitate to drop on the comment section. I will be glad to answer you as soon as possible. Alright? Woohoo! There we go. Remember, number one, elle sait servir seule. Of course, we can see that sait servir, it's le verbe pronominal. Okay? So we say, elles se sont servies seules. They serve themselves. Number two, nous sommes partis tôt ce matin. We went early this morning. Remember, partir is one of the verbs that takes the auxiliary of le verbe être. Number three, je lui ai dit de ne pas prendre ce chemin. I've told him to not take this way or this direction. Number four, ils ont joué à ce jeu la dernière fois. They've played this game the last time. Elle a réussi son examen. She has succeeded in her exam, the exam, or the test. Number six, vous êtes arrivé de bonne heure. You arrived in a good time. Ils ont rendu leurs livres. They've given back the books. Marthe et Jules ont acheté des bonbons. Mark and Jules bought the bonbons, the sweet candies. Number 9. Elle a pleuré toute la journée. She cried the whole day. Okay, guys, it's very simple, isn't it? Of course, you know that you have to practice that more so that you become more fluent. I mean, it's going to be flexible for you, all right? Guys, do not hesitate to ask any questions if you got any doubt, okay? Is there something that you did not understand? Please, feel free to drop your questions on the comment section, all right? Very good, ladies and gentlemen. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.